Chapter 13, The Yellow Hat Again. Jerry and Rachel continued to be on the lookout for the man with the yellow hat, for they were sure that where they saw the hat, they would likely see Ginger. This important day was the 29th of May, a sort of a holiday because it was Jerry's birthday. It happened also to be a Saturday. Early in the morning, Rachel and Jerry set out to explore the great field below the railway station for wild strawberries, which usually grew there in abundance and which they were very fond of, crushed up with milk and sugar. They would surprise Uncle Benny with a cupful of these when he arrived for his regular Saturday morning visit, which was going to be an all-day visit since it was Jerry's birthday. The field was still wet with dew, and it was covered with juicy little ripe berries. Rachel and Jerry filled 3 cups, besides eating the great quantity that they picked. They tasted so good, they then ate all they had picked, except for Uncle Benny's. They were tired of picking any more, and since Uncle Benny was so very little and probably couldn't eat a whole cupful, they then ate half of his. Now they had none left to eat with milk and sugar, but this really didn't matter, since it was Jerry's birthday and they might be going to have ice cream. A scraggly hill covered with pale wild roses led up to the railway station. Here's a picture. And they clambered up it, for they imagined they were going to be just in time to see the Bankers Express go roaring by. Naturally, the Bankers Express never stopped in Cranberry, but Rachel and Jerry loved to watch the speedy train whenever they could and wave to the engineer and the passengers, and catch a glimpse of people eating in the dining car. Not just sandwiches they had packed, but real bacon and eggs and coffee on beautiful white tablecloths. Why the coffee stayed on the tables instead of slopping all over the people and into the aisles was a mystery, the fast way the train went. Anyway, it must, or so many people would not eat in this dangerous fashion. The railway station was one of their most favorite places in the entire town of Cranberry. While waiting for the Bankers Express, they got weighed on the baggage scale several times. They shook the peanut machine and the gum machine for stray pennies, peanuts, and gum. They got and weighed again, with and without their sweaters on. Then they went back out on the platform, for according to the clock, it was about time for the Bankers Express. "Look at the way the railroad tracks meet way off there," said Jerry. "Uh-huh," said Rachel. "That's perspective," she said, for she had just learned that in school. "Uh-huh," agreed Jerry, "perspective." Then, into the perspective, there came a little dot, and it grew rapidly larger and larger with a line of smoke following above it. "Here it comes," shouted Jerry. "Here comes the Bankers Express," shouted Rachel, and they both stood back, expecting to see the train go streaking by the way it always did. But the train didn't streak by. It slowed up, and it did an unheard of thing for the Bankers Express. It stopped. In Cranberry, where it never stopped, it nonetheless stopped. It came to a standstill in such a way that the last coach was at the platform where Jerry and Rachel were standing. Being a very long train, the front of it must be almost out to the reservoir, Jerry and Rachel imagined. The train lurched backwards and forwards for a few moments, as though in perplexity as to what to do. Then it stopped again. "It's getting water or something," Jerry explained. Jerry and Rachel were so excited watching the important train lurch forward and backward and do such an odd thing as stop here at the Cranberry Railroad Station, they didn't notice a big boy standing on the rear platform. But this boy noticed them, and he was watching them intently. Maybe it was his dark, glowering glance that finally made them look at him. Good night! It was Wally Bullwinkle. Wally Bullwinkle with no hat on the Bankers Express. "Where are you going, Wally?" yelled Rachel. "Going to New York, Wally?" asked Rachel. "Going to the Museum of Natural History?" asked Jerry. Wally met these friendly questions with a surly grimace. He thrust out his lower lip and looked as though he would like to pick a fight. "What are you mad at?" asked Jerry curiously. Wally answered something, but what he said they never knew. For at this moment the train slowly and eventually began to move. Wally slapped a hat on his head. And there he stood, Wally Bullwinkle, with an old yellow hat on the Bankers Express. But a gust of wind snatched Wally's hat off, and though he tried to grab it, it was no use. The hat was gone. Wally's hat landed on the platform and rolled to Jerry's feet. It was an old felt hat on the order of the one the unsavory character had worn. Jerry looked at the hat, and he looked at the train, gathering speed now, with Wally clinging to the back railing with one hand and feeling his bare head on the other with the other in bewilderment. Then the train disappeared around the bend, and the Bankers Express, with Wally Bullwinkle on it, was gone. Rachel and Jerry stared at the hat, and they stared at each other, and Rachel said breathlessly, "He did have an old yellow hat on after all. Wasn't spots before our eyes at the skeleton house. Was a hat like Unsavory's." Jerry picked up the hat. Neither he nor Rachel had connected this yellow hat that belonged to Wally Bullwinkle, a boy in Jerry's class and the owner of a dog as so ferocious, as Wally claimed, as the one that bit the nose off Bit-Nosed Ned, with the yellow hat of Unsavory, whose picture they had so often drawn as the villain in the story of the disappearance of Ginger Pie. Jerry said, "We'll save this old hat for him when he comes back." Rachel said, "It looked like Wally was going away for a look good. He had a going away for good look about him." "Oh," said Jerry, slowly remembering, "he might be. He said in the schoolyard the other day that he and his pop, he hasn't any mother, were going to join a vaudeville show. They'd been training for it, he said. It's what his pop used to do, he said. We didn't believe him, Dick Badger and me, 'cause he's always saying something ain't true." Here's a picture of Wally and his hat heading off. "He might have an act with that fierce dog he owns," said Rachel. And then suddenly the same thought struck both of them. The fierce dog might be a ruse. The dog for the act might be Ginger. "The hat!" screamed Rachel. "Has it got the mark in it? The mark, the red mark." Muttering, "Of course not. This is Wally's old hat, not the Unsavory characters." Still Jerry paled, and he took the hat into the bright sunshine, and he turned down the inside band, and there, sure enough, there was the red crayon mark just where Dick Badger had put it that day at the reservoir. And there Wally Bullwinkle was on the Bankers Express. And perhaps he was leaving the town of Cranberry forever. All along, he probably was the one who had stolen Ginger, and not the villain they had drawn a picture of. And was Ginger on the train too, in the baggage car? And did this mean they would never see their dog Ginger again? "He still might not have been the one," murmured Rachel. "He might be one of the yellow hat band of people and not be the one," she said, "like I said." "No," said Jerry, "no." They both stared down the silent, shimmering tracks where the train with Wally had gone. "We could catch the next train," suggested Rachel, "and trail him in New York." She knew this was impossible, but she had to think of something. "Couldn't we have him apprehended in New York?" she wondered. There must be something they could do. Call in Mr. Pye, thought Rachel, and she said they better hurry home and ask Papa what to do anyway. Papa might go to New York himself and bump into Wally on the escalator, the way he had Mama. He would do something. Jerry and Rachel started to race for home as fast as they could go, forgetting to whoop under the bridge when they were so excited. They were sure their dog Ginger was on the Bankers Express, and though he was, they thought, at this very moment being whisked off to New York, they still felt nearer to him than at any time since his disappearance. Jerry held the old hat firmly in his hands. It was a really close link with Ginger, he thought. "You know what?" said Jerry, panting. "First, before we go home, we better go over to Wally's house and see if by any chance Ginger was left behind. See if there's any trace of him or the big fierce dog or what." So they changed their course. On the corner of Elm and New Dollar Street, whom should they see come marching up the street with a hard, firm step but Captain Chief Larimore on his way home for his coffee and buns. When he heard the latest developments in the Ginger Pie case, he turned around and joined Rachel and Jerry in the reconnoitering of the Bullwinkle homestead. Jerry was very proud to be walking along the streets of Cranberry with a policeman, but Rachel was wondering if people were thinking that she and Jerry had been arrested. Then she decided no, people would not think this, since neither she nor Jerry had handcuffs on, and she danced along sometimes a little ahead of the policeman, sometimes a little behind, to accent the fact of their freedom. "The Bullwinkles, eh?" said Chief Larimore, breaking the silence. "A shiftless lot the father is, and like father like son," he said. When they reached Wally Bullwinkle's house, it looked smaller and more shrunken up than ever used to, because it was all boarded up. A for sale sign was tacked in a lopsided fashion on the front. Despite the house's closed-up look, Chief Larimore tramped up the porch and knocked on the door. Presently, the street in front of the house was filled with curious onlookers, chiefly children, though women and men gathered too. Without turning around, Chief Larimore called for a hammer and a small axe. In no time at all, a half-dozen or more of these were offered to him, and Chief Larimore pried off the boarding from one of the front windows, and he stepped, telling Jerry and Rachel they might come in too and identify their dog. if he was here, which he didn't think so, but who could be sure of anything? Not a policeman. They cannot jump to conclusions, he said, though it was all right to follow up a good hunch. Everybody else outside wanted to come in too, but permission was not granted. So they stayed without, waiting for a little something to be said to satisfy their curiosity. Chief Larimore, followed by Rachel and Jerry, went from room to room. Meager furniture stood in each room. There was certainly no dog in this house, no live one, that is, for there were plenty of pictures of dogs and posters of dogs, and most of these were of the circus and the vaudeville variety, doing this trick and that, jumping through hoops and everything. Still, from the look of the place, the Bullwinkles had gone for good, at least for a long, long time. "The backyard now," said Chief Larimore, and he pushed open the flimsy back door. He was so strong he needed no hammer or axe for this, and the three inspectors found themselves in a high-fenced small yard with a shed in one corner. There was barbed wire fence on top of the fence, and there were a number of huge signs on the shed, on the fences, on the house itself, saying, "Big dog, keep out," and "Beware of the big dog." "Those are to throw you off the track," said Chief Larimore, "your dog being little." In the little shed, which was open, they found any number of old gnawed bones, a little pile of rags with some ginger-colored hairs on them, and also, again, any number of vaudeville and circus posters, all with dogs on them, dogs on the order of Ginger, if Ginger were a big dog and not a little puppy. There was a broken strand of frayed rope tied to a hook. Here Ginger must have been kept. Here he must have slept and eaten and perhaps cried for Jerry and Rachel to come and find him. Jerry picked up some of the old rags Ginger must have slept on. While feeling proud that, like detectives, he could identify the hairs of his dog, remembering the color so well, a terrible lump was growing in his throat. For Ginger was gone, yet had been here all the while. It probably was Ginger he had heard whining the night that he and Rachel came to the skeleton house. They had been right all along that Ginger was nearer them over here where they had first heard the mysterious footsteps. There's a picture inside the house. "You threw me off, lad, with the picture you drew of the man," said Chief Larimore. "We threw it ourselves off, and all of us off track," admitted Jerry ruefully. "We didn't know an unsavory character could just be a boy in my class. We thought it had to be a man." "Wally did have a yellow hat on the night we saw him at the skeleton house," said Rachel. "It wasn't spots before our eyes or in our belfry. It was Wally." Chief Larimore twirled his nightstick and looked important. "Skeleton houses," he said, pondering. "Even if we'd been sure that it was a hat just like the hat of the unsavory character, we might not have thought Wally was the unsavory character himself. We thought there might have been a band of yellow hat wearers, and Wally, might be under the spell of Fagin." "Fagin?" said Chief Larimore. "Sir Chief," said Jerry, "Rachel once thought some perfectly good tomatoes were poison tomatoes, and we had to bury them." "I see," said Chief Larimore, but he looked confused. "I like to stick to the facts," he said. "As I see it, the Bullwinkles with your dog have gone. They've gone to join a circus, I would deduce." "Gone," said Jerry. "My dog." "We will have the train watched from New York to Boston," promised the able new policeman. "And from Boston to New York," he added, for anyone could see that Jerry and Rachel felt badly. "Let the Bullwinkles try and come back to Cadbury," he said. He said he would lock the father up for stealing a dog and perhaps maltreating him. He was a villain, an unsavory character, a black blot on Cranberry, and he was not welcome here. They had not had to use the jail in 10 years, but let the Bullwinkles come back and they would use the jail now, all right, and he, for one, and he was sure Judge Ball would concur, hoped they would use it for a good long time, maybe 10 years. Sadly, Rachel and Jerry followed the policeman back through the house and out the front door again to the waiting throng. They didn't care about the jail and 10 years there. All they wanted was Ginger back again. That was all, and that was everything to them. "Go home," bade the policeman to the curious bystanders. Disband. A dog is gone." The crowd disbanded. "A dog is gone," they said, satisfied with this tidbit, but disappointed it was not a murder. Jerry and Rachel said goodbye to the policeman in front of George Ball's house, where their ways parted. They were so choked up they couldn't even thank Chief Larimore for skipping his coffee and buns to come to the reconnoitering. "Bye," they said. They didn't remember any more that it was Jerry's birthday and that they might have ice cream. But once they had parted from Chief Larimore, they tore for home anyway. Thoughts of Ginger speeding away on the Bankers Express put speed in their toes, too. Papa just had to think of what to do next. It was all right for Chief Larimore to say he'd have all trains watched from New York to Boston and from Boston to New York. It was circuses that had to be watched now, they thought. Chief Larimore's ideas were all right as far as they went. He was a wonderful chief of police to have kept the jail empty the way Chief Mulligan before him had done, too, for 10 years. This showed how orderly they had both kept the town of Cranberry so far. But ideas of a more dramatic nature were necessary now, the kind of ideas Papa must have every second, or the men in Washington would not be forever saying, "Call in Mr. Pye." Here's a picture of the circus. That was the sort of thinking Rachel and Jerry were doing as they rounded the corner, skidding the way Ginger used to. They were going so fast and sprinted, panting, down Beam's place to home. During these exciting ventures, they had lost all of Uncle Benny's berries, but not the cups.